Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing not too bad. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and in fact, this is The Wright Show. And you are Tanya, or if we want to go by your pen name, T.M. Luhrmann, the author of this fascinating book, When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God. You're also a professor of anthropology at Stanford, unless I'm mistaken.
I am.
And presumably you're somewhere in or near Palo Alto, even as we speak.
I am.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. As I said, really fascinating book.
Thank you.
About the, you might say the evangelical mind. I don't know if you put it that way, but what goes on in the evangelical mind when communication with God is taking place. And, you know, anthropologists are known for, especially in the old days, say 100 years ago, anthropologists were known for studying exotic cultures and reporting back about them. I don't know if you considered evangelicals quite exotic when you first approached them some years ago and began studying them, but they definitely... their culture is definitely a different culture from the one you were brought up in, right? So
that's right. So
do you want to tell us a little about your background with respect to religion?
I grew up kind of as a spiritual mutt. My mother's father was a Baptist minister, and so that's not so far afield. I would say that my three cousins, the sons of her sisters, are within evangelical or fundamentalist culture. My father is a doctor, and his father was a Christian Scientist. So my
that's intense in its own way.
Yes. So and my mother kind of drifted away from faith. I mean, it's important enough to both my parents to have a faith connection that they have always had a church to which they've attended, but it's often been a Unitarian church.
Right.
And I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood as well, and I was kind of a Shabbos goy for a while.
Meaning that you would, like on Saturday, you would go help the Orthodox Jews do things they weren't allowed to do on Saturdays?
That's right. So I would be invited over on, say, a Friday evening or a Saturday morning, and I'd turn on and off the electric switch. I kind of allow the electric disposal to do its thing.
Okay. And so to the extent that you went to church yourself, it was in a Unitarian church. And I think as someone who's been to Unitarian church service more than once, sometimes going to a Unitarian church is remarkably like not going to church at all.
Right.
Would you
Absolutely.
call that?
I mean, that's why, one reason why I was so interested in the evangelical story. And one reason, I mean, at some point I just realized I was just ignorant of the Bible. I mean, we did, Lawrence Kohlberg moral dilemmas in Sunday school. We did not read texts.
Yeah, that's Unitarianism.
Right.
So, so you decided to study evangelicals. You focus in particular on relatively new variant called the Vineyard.
Yes.
It's one of these new churches, and I gather there are Vineyard churches in a number of cities.
Yeah, they're about
Is that and you spent a number of years. What does it mean? What kinds of things can communicating with God mean to these evangelicals?
So I think it's a pretty broad idea that God communicates through circumstance. And even in the Unitarian church, there's some idea like that you go for, you're going for a walk, and you run into a friend that you hadn't thought you'd run into, and so and you ask yourself whether God is wanting you to develop your relationship with this friend. God speaking through Scripture is also a pretty common idea. That's when you're reading the text and you come across a verse and it somehow really stands out to you. You feel different. You feel warm in your body, or you feel suddenly alive or suddenly sleepy or something different. And you feel that God is really drawing your attention to that verse.
And is it, in those cases, is it often the case that you see some kind of relevance to something maybe you've been wrestling with in your own life? I mean, in other words, the guidance it gives you is kind of suddenly apparent?
Yes. And the way that many people in this culture, and evangelicalism is a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different people, roughly somewhere between a third and 40% of the country would use that term to describe themselves. And so what's happening is that people are reading the Bible as it's both literally true or near literally true, and it was written for them. It's a love letter written for them. So it's a very non-historical way to engage with the Bible. You are reading in, say, the book of Judges, and the question is, what does this passage have to say to me about my meeting this afternoon? And that's, so when somebody reads a biblical verse and then they find themselves, they feel that God has spoken to them through it. God is telling them, they infer that God is telling them something specific to their immediate life. What the Vineyard does is something that is more unusual to many Americans, but I think pretty common in many different evangelical circles. And it's the idea that thoughts and mental images that crop up in your mind are also God speaking directly to you. And that not all your thoughts, of course. You have to learn to pick out which thoughts count as God's voice and which thoughts are yours. And so
what kind of tips do they give you for that? How do you know when it's God talking and when it's just another one of your thoughts?
So I was impressed about how thoughtful people were by that decision. I mean, it sounds frightening. It sounds terrifying to somebody in the secular world that people have a thought, they decide that it's God's, they must act on it. But I actually thought the process was much more sensible than it might appear. The church talks about discernment, so they teach you the skill of discerning what is God's voice, and they basically invite you to look for thoughts that are, pop into your mind spontaneously. They are different from something that you were thinking about. They should be in line with God's character, and in this setting, God is a wonderful guy. This is not the God of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. This is a God of love. He has, in the worlds I was spending time, God and Jesus have very similar characters. And so God does not tell you to hurt yourself. He does not tell you to hurt other people. So if you're drawing that inference, that is God.
So there are actually kind of substantive guidelines. Like if you have this kind of thought, that's definitely not God talking. Right. If you have a thought of revenge or something, that's not God.
That's right.
There are substantive guidelines of that sort?
Yes, and there's gossip in the church about it as well.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so among the people I know, many people had certain experiences that they were utterly confident were thoughts given to them by God. God was talking to them. But for an awful lot of their experiences, they are not quite sure. People are really aware that once you're picking out God from your mind, your ordinary human stuff can interfere. My favorite example is, so I was once in the church, and there's a young woman with a blissful expression up on her face. Blissful expression on her face up at the front of the church, explaining that God had spoken to her and told her that he wanted her to do missionary work in Puerto Vallarta. And the church, in effect, should cough up money to support this. And the guy standing next to me leaned over and whispered, "Boy, God sure wants a lot of work done in Puerto Vallarta." And there's a sense that, she thinks that God intends this man for her. I don't know if that's God's voice. And when people inferred that God was telling them to be calm and everything was going to be fine, you don't really have to worry too much about whether that's God. When people think that they heard God said, move to Los Angeles, then what happens in practice is that they get their friends to pray with them, they get the pastor to pray with them, they pray for many months, and so what they're experiencing...
You mean kind of trying to find out whether that was really God's message?
Right. And
so they think they've heard something from God, but they want their friends to get in on the consultation. So
one of the things, it's sort of confusing to do this on. Anyway, it's sorry, I was just trying to get my hair looking more orderly.
Feel free.
But it's like the image anyway. So one of the ways that you think about this, so if God has truly spoken, you should feel pretty good. You should feel a sense of peace. And so sometimes what people are describing is actually praying until they feel peaceful about a decision. Mm-hmm. They also ask you to test your inference against the world. So if you feel that God is telling you to stay put in your apartment, but you don't have money to support that apartment, you also kind of expect that God is going to get you a job so you can support the apartment. And so so your friends having those experiences is a kind of test. So people would pray for something, they would have a certain mental image, then they would ask their friends to pray for that for them, and then report back their experience. And so you're also implicitly getting a lot of social input from people.
Yeah, a whole lot.
Yeah.
But I guess it does sometimes happen that there is a really strong sense of conviction that emerges suddenly. I mean, especially, sometimes you've been wrestling with a decision. Right. And suddenly, and it may be that even non-religious people, I think sometimes will kind of almost see a sign, hear something on the radio or whatever. But for whatever reason, whether it's under that kind of stimulus or not, there are times when you just suddenly you feel you've finally reached closure, and this is the right thing to do. And I guess they have those experiences too, and they feel that is God giving them closure.
So part of what you're doing in this church is learning to think about your mind a new way. I call this a theory of mind. You need to imagine your mind as open to other people or another person, a person-like being. It's not walled off from the world. Mm-hmm. But in the way that they learn to imagine it, they're actually drawing on everyday human psychology, so that all of us have what I would think of as a topography of mind. We have ways of imagining or judging our own mental experience so that we take some thoughts more seriously than other thoughts. Mm-hmm. Thoughts that pop into our mind, we sometimes take more seriously because it doesn't feel like we generated the thought. It just happened. Dreams are a great example. Everyone psychologists demonstrate that you can get undergraduates to prove that everybody takes dreams seriously.
Seriously, in the sense of, at a minimum, thinking it's their unconscious trying to express something. You mean?
At least pausing. So the experiment that I'm thinking about is that you ask a bunch of people, always undergraduates, whether if they're about to take a plane trip, and the night before they were going to take the plane trip, they had a terrible dream of a plane crash. Would it affect their judgment about the plane trip? So most undergraduates will say that they'll get on the plane. Not all of them will. But almost all of them will say that they think, they have to think through their decision to get on the plane.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and it is the case that just regular thinking sometimes is a little like, maybe not literally like hearing voices, but I mean, thoughts just kind of show up. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they are phrases, kind of, and so in a way, it is a kind of a natural use of normal human cognition, it seems to me, to think of it as some of it as originating externally. That,
right. And I think what's striking to me. It's also, though, a training process, so that people are encouraging themselves to kind of sort of relax and allow some of these more spontaneous processes to happen, to pay attention to them. When I was doing this, I had some experiences that I would have, and I say, oh, that feels like God speaking to me. And I think of them kind of in the way that writers sometimes think about good writing experiences. So there are times when you're writing and a phrase just comes to you, and it just happens, and it's right. And I would have sometimes I the first time I had this experience, I was trying to compose a note to somebody I didn't know. He was kind of he was, in charge of grants, and I wanted one of those grants, and but the note wasn't. But it was also sort of a personal note because we'd had this conversation, and I kind of was percolating around for a couple of days, and then the note that I wanted to write just came to me. Wrote it, and it really worked. I mean, it sort of provoked the kind of response that I wanted to provoke in that interaction. And I think in the church, people would have talked about waiting for God and recognizing God's presence.
Is it John Nash, the movie and book A Beautiful Mind? He of course was schizophrenic, and
right.
And heard voices and stuff. And in his less schizophrenic mode, when he was, I guess, in recovery, somebody said, how could you, wasn't it kind of weird that these voices were happening? And he said, well, that was basically the way my big mathematical ideas had always come to me. They had always come as if from without. So it just wasn't such a leap to start actually hearing voices.
Right. I do think that the kinds of experiences people report in schizophrenia are different in kind from the way people hear God in the religious setting. Again, it's the human mind. And if there is a God, I think that God speaks through the human mind. And, as an anthropologist, I can say something about that process. But yeah, what I actually saw was that people who practiced this business of listening for God and who practiced prayer so that they were giving more attention to their imaginative world, taking their imaginative experience seriously, they were also more likely to have report that God had spoken to them audibly. That wasn't very common. It was, they had a handful of experiences, but they really heard God's audible voice. And I thought there was a story to tell about cultivating your attention to your inner experience so that your inner world does sort of come more to life, and sometimes that manifests itself in these more unusual experiences.
You said that there are kind of substantive guidelines, that, okay, look, if you have an impulse to kill somebody, that's not God talking. Is it easy to summarize what some of these are? And does it kind of correspond to the Ten Commandments or anything? Is it, okay, lust for someone you're not married to, bad? Is it that simple, or what are some of the guidelines?
Okay, I'd say there were 4. First of all, it's the thought spontaneous. It pops into your mind. You weren't thinking about it before. And also I put into that category a strong thought. You notice it. Okay. Second rule, the thought is consonant with God. So that includes the Ten Commandments. It also includes God's character. God, as the pastor said to me once, God does not tell you to hurt yourself. If you think that God is telling you to jump off a bridge, that's not God. Third rule, test it. So test it, and I heard a pastor talk about this only a couple of months ago. A New Vineyard church in New York I went to, and he said, look, most of the things that God says, are about being calm and being relaxed and not doubting yourself. That's fine. If God tells you something much more demanding, you want to make sure that that's right. And that's when you consult your friends, etc. And then the fourth rule is really peace. So third rule is tested. Fourth rule is peace.
You mean if it gives you peace?
Yes. So you should feel good when you're in communication with God.
Uh-huh. And it does, when you think about it, it's probably very secular people be tempted to dismiss this as kind of delusional thinking this way. But there is a parallel, it seems to me, with kind of ordinary, the way non-religious people would think, just in the following sense. When you are struggling with something and you suddenly have the conviction that, okay, this is the way to go.
Yeah.
When you think about it, that's an irrational conviction, because the truth is you just don't know. The way the future is, there's no telling what the right thing to do is. The fact that you've been wrestling with it means that the evidence itself is not really decisive.
Right.
And yet we do, some of us, I'm actually not very good at this, but I know that normal people are very good at getting a sense of closure and certainty. And when you think about it, that's a delusion. There's something irrational happening at that moment when you feel really this is the way to go, right?
Absolutely.
And so it seems to me this is just kind of a particular path to that irrational but useful conviction. And it involves some kind of reasonable stuff, like consulting with your friends,
Yep. Yep. And it allows you to take leaps in ways that you might not feel comfortable doing otherwise. It allows you to feel confidence in those decisions. So I was on a radio program a little while ago, and a young woman called in and said that she'd grown up as this kind of Christian, and not in the Vineyard. Many kinds of churches invite this kind of personal engagement with God and dependence on God. And she lost her faith in college. And she said that when she initially lost her faith, she was terrified because she had made decisions relying on God for so many years, and she wasn't sure she could do that anymore. She didn't believe in God anymore. She wasn't sure that she could make decisions anymore. And then she found that, she said, that what she was doing was really, now she would call intuition. And that she had to trust what she now called intuition, and feel good about it, but that the same decision-making processes were still pretty much involved.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is what the evangelicals do well and get right is that they allow themselves to trust their own thought process and feel comfortable about it, and to sort of vividly imagine an interlocutor that is a really helpful interlocutor. Because if you think about this from a secular perspective, you've got to use your imagination to represent God, and that doesn't mean that God's imaginary. It means that God's invisible. You're going to interact with God. You've got to use an awareness of more than what you're seeing in the world before you. So what people do is they draw on what they know of their own interactions. They design the kind of kindest, wisest, most caring person they can possibly imagine. And then they set themselves up in having a conversation with that person. It looks an awful lot like talking to your conscience.
Right. So, and that's another parallel with what what non-religious people might do. They would like to be able to think that the decisions they reach are right in a moral sense, as well as being right in a practical kind of good for you sense.
Right.
And this is a particular way to arrive at that conviction. It's an algorithm for reaching a decision that is practically useful and aligns with your sense of moral right.
That's right. And it's also, I think, psychologically helpful. So the other way I came to think about this is that, you're designing this person who's the amalgam of the best traits of your mom and your dad or whoever took care of you and loved you in your childhood. You're representing this person as eternal and, but really all about you. I mean, this is, to an outsider, it sounds a little contradictory that God is both, God is intimately personal for everybody. But that's the way, that's the way that this kind of church represents God. And so, and people know that they're always misrepresenting God, that God is a mystery, that you are using your limited human reason to represent God. So, but they all of us, I think, are soothed by the, psychologists sometimes call it a self-object. We're soothed by the memories that we carry around with us of people who've loved us. And so when things are kind of rough, you kind of remember that, your mom said it was going to be okay, and so what, but, many people have more complicated relationships with their mom and dad and people around them. What the church does is, in effect, invite people to create an amalgam of the best. They surround it with a lot of, weekly, daily reminders of how important this representation is. And I actually thought that people did carry that around with them. And so if you do these kind of little Mickey Mouse experimental things, you ask people whether they feel God's love directly. 7-point scale. Not at all the time. The higher people are up on that scale, it happens to be significantly related to their being less stressed and being less lonely. So, I think that's also worth attending to.
Now, when you say that this is a God of love and not a God of anger, is it your sense that represents some shift of emphasis within evangelicism over the last, say, 30, 40 years? I mean, I was brought up Southern Baptist, and it was, the love thing was really emphasized for sure, the love and forgiveness. But I don't know. It did not leave me with a real strong inclination to forgive myself, to take it easy on myself. I don't remember that being a theme, like don't beat up on yourself. Nobody ever said that to me, And there was a sense that you really should scrutinize your behavior pretty harshly. Now, so has something changed, do you think, over the last few decades?
Yes. And I actually think that you capture this pretty nicely in The Evolution of God. So I think that God has become a nicer guy over the course of human history. And I think that particularly since 1965, God has become pretty much unconditionally loving in the United States. Big thing that happened in 1965 is that there became a buyer's market in Christianity. There were many ways of being Christian. There were many ways you didn't have to be Christian. You didn't have to be religious at all. There was much more of a kind of a national discussion, and there's Mahesh Yogi, and there's Bhagwan, and all these things. And so as the evangelical church emerged in this post-1965 form, and it changes in 1965, you basically have the kind of traditional, what we would call fundamentalists, kind of merging with the hippie Christians, and with this much more experiential Christianity. God becomes intimate. God becomes democratically experienced by everybody in the congregation in these kinds of churches, and God becomes entirely good. There are, it's not that hell has vanished from the churches I spent time with, but people never talked about hell. People talked continuously about how much God loved you. Sin was the shadow that fell between you and God. That was when you couldn't feel God's love. So if you just, allowed yourself not to do that, you would really get it. God loved you. You just weren't allowing yourself to feel his presence.
Yeah, now they did. I mean, so it's 1965. I was going to Sunday school in 1965. And since this was mainly in Texas, we were probably a little behind in terms of the conversion to an entirely loving God. I certainly remember references to hell. for sure. But you're saying that's when the shift kind of starts.
And again, I see a certain kind of evangelical Christianity there. It's a messy tent. It's a big tent, and there are a lot of different kinds of Christianity in it. And there are a lot of different, in any congregation, you have people relating to God very differently. And the church will talk about people who are church wounded and have the wrong idea about God. So a lot of Christian therapy involves working, even if you're dealing with eating disorders or some kind of addiction, people imagine that as working on your God concept. So if your God concept, if you truly believed God was loving, you wouldn't need to throw up, everything you ate. And so it's Rob Bell.
And you're saying this. I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish that, and I'll ask the question.
So Rob Bell wrote a book recently that caused untold, conversation and trauma in many of these theologically conservative churches, and he said basically God is unconditionally loving, hell doesn't exist. And he was in effect thrown out of the church because that was such a dramatic...
That was going too far.
It was going too far to say it out loud. But when you read the literature and when you... Rick Warren would probably be horrified by Rob Bell, but that's kind of the implication of the purpose-driven life. People are saying these things, people are kind of carrying with them an implicit yes-no Christianity. But the invitation is an invitation to experience God as purely loving, as available for you.
So that's a big part of the Rick Warren message. He started the Saddleback Church and is almost embodies kind of the modern, kind of like neo-evangelical success story. And then A Purpose-Driven Mind was his mega bestseller. And is that a big theme in that? Kind of don't beat up on yourself?
Yes. You have, I think the first sentence is, you are not an accident. And it's a lot like cognitive behavioral therapy. It identifies the self-critical, fearful, critical thoughts that you have. And it invites you to replace them with ideas about yourself that you would have if you saw yourself from God's perspective. So your loving Father put you on earth for a particular reason. You might not know that right now.
But I guess what saves the book, notwithstanding the emphasis on being kind to yourself, what saves the book from being egocentric is in the title, The Purpose-Driven Life. In other words, you're supposed to focus not on yourself. It's not about you, is a famous theme in the book. You're supposed to be absorbed in a larger purpose.
Yes, and that's what makes it different from cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's this sense of, so the themes of community, the themes of kind of seeing God in other people, they're all there. And that is, probably not what a therapist is going to talk to you about when you're talking. But, it's the same idea of the human fearfulness, anxiety, sense of failure, criticism, worthlessness should be replaced with a sense that you're here for a purpose, you should take care of other people, God is talking to you, God should be your best friend. Rick Warren, and again, so what's going on in Christianity? Rick Warren's book tells you that it's not about experiencing God for experience's sake. He also tells you to make God into your best friend. So there's this use of the kind of charismatic experience in order to know God more intimately.
So in a word, what is the part of Rick Warren's message that you're saying is like cognitive behavioral therapy?
Recognize the bad thoughts and replace them with good thoughts. So he has a lot of content that a cognitive behavioral therapist would not. But
see things like gnawing anxiety as faults in a fundamental sense.
See yourself from
Go ahead.
So I call it seeing yourself from God's perspective. So you're really being invited to not look out of yourself at the world with all the dangers that it presents for you, and instead see yourself with love from the perspective of God, and to experience your sense, you wouldn't be afraid if you knew that God wanted you to do this. You wouldn't be kind of so mean to your coworkers if you remembered that you were loved. So I really think it's you can see this from many different perspectives, but it certainly has a story to tell.
Although kind of a prerequisite for that consolation, right, is to be sure that you are following the path that God wants, kind of, right? And which gets us back to what your book is about, figuring out what God wants you to do. But that's part of the reason you're supposed to be able to relax and not be hard on yourself, right?
Right. And it's really about, I think that it's a lot about anxiety. That if you mean a lot of what evangelicism is successfully addressing in people is anxiety? Yeah, fear and anxiety. And a sense of, in Rick Warren's terms, purposelessness. And again, if you really remembered that God loved you, you wouldn't yell at your kids. And of course people yell at their kids all the time. But I do think that there is evidence that making people aware of feeling loved by someone worth being loved by is sort of supports lots of evidence that supports their health experience, makes them healthier. And I think that it's actually emotionally very, very powerful for people. Again, one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is that as I saw people learn, the big thing that my book is about is that this is a learning process. This is something that people would learn. It's not like belief, yes or no. It's about the way in which you learn to experience yourself in a relationship with what you say is God, and how you do that and how that changes the mind. And so I talk about learning to pick God out of your thoughts and learning to imagine God, and then these emotional practices. It was pretty clear to me that the hardest thing to do in this church was to really have an experience of being loved unconditionally. That it's just not something that humans do naturally. And and so people would talk about these precious moments when they got it, they really got it, and then it disappeared. And they're often powerful moments, so that I'm talking to somebody in her living room, I've got a cup of tea, she's my recorder's running, and she begins to fall apart in tears, and she's crying because she remembers something that's so precious to her when she really got it that Jesus loved her. And, and obviously one of the reasons that there's a church, a social structure of having a church, is that it's hard to remember any portion of that when you go over the course of an ordinary week. But those moments really stood out for people.
And do you have a theory about why this kind of religion is working today for people? I mean, is there some psychological need in people right now in 2012 that is just more acute than it was 40 years ago? And is there a discernible reason for that?
Yeah, so I think it's about doubt. I think it's about the awareness that there are many different ways to live in the world. There is a role now, particularly now, last 10 years with the new atheists. Even in Texas, people know that there are, reasonable, sensible people who are probably good people who don't believe in God, or who believe in a very different understanding of God. And so what this kind of religiosity does is that it does two big things. First of all, it gives you a personal experience of God. So God talks to you. You know that. You felt it. You probably felt, because there are all these, cool spiritual experiences people can have when they, particularly with these kinds of rich prayer practices, you probably felt God's presence or heard his voice. It's also true that as that happens, God moves into the mind so that people are acutely aware that they might be wrong in their belief that it was really God. They certainly know that if God is talking to everybody in the congregation, I mean, you really know that many of those people are getting God wrong. And it makes God mysterious. It makes God about practicing learning to hear him. It makes God about contradiction. It makes God about something that's really real. But it's real in a different kind of way. The folks I knew were very clear that God existed. But they had an experience of God in which God would show up and God would go away, and God was in a different kind of realness than the table they were sitting at. So I think
go ahead.
So I think it just makes God both more accessible and more mysterious, and it allows people to hold on to God while having complicated ideas about belief.
Now, one thing you say in your book, which I hadn't heard before, although for all I know this is commonplace among religious scholars, was that we actually are in the midst of another so-called Great Awakening, right? I mean, historians say that there have been, depending on your count, either 2 or 3 before.
Right.
And
in America.
In America. And was the first one in the mid-1700s? I actually live about a mile from the grave of Jonathan Edwards, who was instrumental in the one that in the middle of the 1700s, right? He traveled around and I mean, tell us what characterizes a Great Awakening.
So when Americans yearn to feel God intensely. So there have been, roughly mid 18th century, early 19th century, late 19th century, and since 1965. And people have sought to experience God in those sessions intimately, in their bodies. So people would come to revival meetings and they would fall over. Because the Holy Spirit would sweep down the church and it would hit you and you would fall over. People would speak in tongues. Tongues is actually much more recent. People would speak would feel God's breath. They would feel His presence enter them. Max Weber said that this was the challenge of charisma. Is that, and this would be called charisma, when there's this thing that is powerful, you can't quite explain it, and you feel it, and it draws you to it. The terrible risk with charisma is that it cools down after a while, and it's scary. So that if people feel God intimately, it's to some extent that's threatening to the church because it's harder to control. So the Great Awakenings explode, and then they cool down, and then they explode, and so I think that we're right. I mean, the 60s was a period of enormous spiritual revitalization. The baby boomers, left church. The church they grew up in great numbers, and about a third of them are now back to church again, and these churches that they return to are more demanding of them. They demand more in them of time and commitment and belief claim. These churches are really powerful. It has to be said that there's also within the evangelical world a sense that evangelicalism is now in crisis, and that's really fueled by the fact that out of the observation that the young are not, the movement is not expanding, and the young are now leaving the church, or at least holding very different social beliefs. They're much more socially liberal than their parents. And we'll see what will happen with that.
Well, one question I was going to ask you was how well this transmits through the generations, because my sense was that, a number of people arrived there via some kind of conversion experience or some kind of dramatic experience that sometimes has to do with the particular circumstances of their lives, and it's almost more powerful for them by virtue of the fact that it wasn't always there for them, right? And I was wondering, whether, once it's kind of routinized and they start bringing up their children that way, whether the power of that can be transmitted to a child who has it, from the crib.
Well, it can be, because I certainly know many people who were brought up in this faith, and what happens is that, in effect, you need to rediscover it. So many people go through periods of doubt in their, in their high school, college years, and they come back, or they leave, or they join a different kind of faith. But that's exactly the issue that the evangelicals are worried about, that the kids do seem to be drifting, or at least enough kids are drifting so that they fear they're lost, and they're not being joined by new kids. And so... I think the jury is out. I don't think we know what's happening.
Now, you mentioned 1965, and there is an intersection here with the counterculture, right? I mean, and even with drugs. I mean, some of these people that you describe had some of their formative religious experiences while on hallucinogens.
Yes.
Talk about that a little.
So, what seems to have happened is that fundamentalist Christianity acquired that name in the 1920s. So many of all of the mainstream American churches liberalized. Jesus became a wise teacher. People downplayed the miracles. This has kind of been response to the rise of science. You could reconcile religion and science, and then there was a splitting of different churches. So the Southern Baptists split away from the Northern Church, I think, at this point. And the fundamental and the folks who split away from this liberalizing church claimed to believe that they were going to stand by the fundamentals, the things in the Bible that you couldn't liberalize. Among them, the miracles described in the Gospels. And they really withdrew from mainstream American life. They sometimes didn't vote. They didn't participate. They were seen as fools during the Scopes trial. They were just on the outskirts of American culture. And in the 1940s, a group of men decided to create a new evangelical Christianity that was going to engage with mainstream America. They founded Fuller Theological Seminary, terribly important place. And as they were moving towards the mainstream, many of the hippies in the early 60s and then on through the 60s kind of picked up ideas about Christianity and made a hippie Christianity in which went right back to the Gospels. Jesus kind of looks like a hippie. The apostles kind of look like a hippie. And they somehow figured out about speaking in tongues. Pentecostalism was this weird little back eddy in American public culture at this point. But the hippie Christians picked up speaking in tongues. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think anyone really knows how hippie Christianity emerged. It's really important, and it's a really untold story. There's a great dissertation that hopefully by Larry Eldridge, which tells some of this story. But as the hippies were becoming hippies and seeking out experience, LSD became one way to get that experience. Christianity became another. And so there were these kids on the California beaches were in effect the message was, and some of the more fundamentalist preachers came with this message: LSD is a short-term high, Holy Spirit will have you forever. And they sort of joined forces in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, and these kids sometimes would find Jesus while high on LSD. So one of the best-known stories is that of Lonnie Frisbee, who was absolutely in this process of converting God while people were dropping acid, converting people to God while dropping acid. But it was a huge movement. It was thousands and thousands of kids. My own take is that it was kind of tough to be a hippie. Back in the summer of love, 1967, thousands and thousands of people arrived in San Francisco. The city facilities broke down. I think rape was pretty common. People were sleeping on the street. You went through these Christian hangouts. They fed you. They made sure you were safe. They put you in houses where you would be, you could eat, get shower, get housed. And so it seemed like a safe retreat from an extremely tumultuous time. And you still got the stuff of being a hippie. You still got the direct experience, and people feel terrific when they speak in tongues.
Yeah. Well, you were a Jesus freak, right? I mean, is this the species that term refers to? So non-Christian hippies would call these hippies Jesus freaks, right?
Right. And they had all the hippiness of the hippies, and the flowers in their hair, and the long dresses, and they were radical action, and it was pretty easy to draft Jesus as a radical actor. I mean, storms into the temple, throws over all those tables. And the people imagined that they were by his side. That was what they did.
Yeah, in 1968 and 69, I was actually in San Francisco. My father was in the Army, so we lived on the Presidio.
Wow.
And so I was like 12, 13 years old, and I remember the youth, so we went to a chapel on post, and the youth minister who ran the youth program, to give it like credibility in our eyes, street cred, he brought in a hippie Christian, with like long hair. I don't think my parents were thrilled about this, but there was more than one. I mean, there was this culture that he kind of wanted to draw into our world as a way of showing us that Christianity was cool, I think.
Right.
And it's funny, I remember, speaking of this, I remember at a retreat asking the hippie, his name was Oliver, he was probably in his mid-20s, and he said God had basically told him to major in biology or something. And I remember asking him, I was like 12, how do you know when God wants you to, and I really wanted to know, how do you know when God wants you to do something? And now you've written a book, finally. I don't think I got a satisfactory answer from Oliver, but you've given us the answer in this book.
Well, thank you.
So we're about out of time. Just one final question. So if you compare this culture, evangelical culture, and the particular part of it that you looked at with, say, mainline Christianity, with people who go to, an Episcopal church or something, what would you say is common to the two experiences? What are they both getting out of church? And what would you say is distinctive about what the evangelicals are getting out of church?
I think the imagination of God in general is kind of the same. I think that God has become a much nicer, kinder, more soothing presence across the Christian spectrum for many, many churches, not for all of them. And I think that they are all getting that sense of community, that sense of that, I think people get a sense of believing that the world is good. I think that the way I think about it, the minimum religious commitment is the sense that the world is good despite excellent evidence to the contrary. That's, I think that's the invitation. What the evangelicals, this more experiential evangelical practice gives you is a personal, intimate, back and forth relationship with God. And it gives you this, God as self-object, God who sort of stays with you all the time, who reminds you that things are really going to be okay. That kind of the role that your memory of the best aspects of your mom and dad give to you, that gets bolstered with a whole lot of stuff in the evangelical church, and it's bolstered, and it's not bolstered in the mainstream churches, but it's much more so. And I think a mainstream church, there's more invitation to think of you shouldn't join if you don't believe in God. And there's this paradox that in the evangelical church, it sounds like belief in God is much more important, but you get to experience God, and so belief, I think people manage their doubts more easily.
And I mean, is that also because the evangelical churches are more, evangelical? I mean, they're out there looking for recruits more aggressively and preaching the gospel to do that. So they have to be open to a variety of customers.
Yeah, that's part of it. But also in your own experience. I mean, I really do think that these days there is an issue of, you can't avoid the salience of doubt, even if you never allow yourself to doubt belief commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And once God becomes so intimate that he talks to you, you're able to manage those periods when you think, I don't know if I take any of this stuff seriously at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a member of a prayer group in this church, and so I was struck by two things. First of all, what was I doing when I prayed? Well, that's a complicated question, but the kinds of things that I said about my experience were not very different from what the women would say about their experience. And somebody once opened the group by saying, I don't believe it, but I'm sticking with it. That's my definition of faith. That's, that doesn't sound like evangelical Christianity, but that's a lot of what I saw. How God could become very intimate, but you could tolerate, you're just not getting it this month.
Yeah.
You're going to keep going to church. You would say you believe in God on those surveys. And it sort of allows for that flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time, Tanya. As I said, highly recommended. When God Talks Back, published by the highly prestigious Knopf.
Thank you.
And a lot of years in the making, obviously. A lot of research went into this, and it shows. So thanks for and good luck with the book, and good luck in your ongoing research. You're sticking with this culture for a while, are you?
Well, I think I'm next. I have another part of my life where I study schizophrenia, and what I want to do is figure out how different ideas about the mind change both psychotic experience and spiritual experience when you move around the world. I do think that spiritual experience is very different from schizophrenic experience, but I think that if you imagine your mind differently, it changes them both in similar ways, or at least that's what I. So.
Huh. Okay. Well, sounds like we got another good book in you then. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.